The theme for the next, I really don't know, I must apologize. I'm very poor at estimating how long any given set of stuff is going to take me to do, so I don't know if I'm going to finish this in one lecture or two. But at any rate, the theme for the next block of stuff, so to speak, is the rise of big business and the failure of trusts and cartels, covering essentially the late 19th century and the early 20th. The reference here, the basic reference, is the theme of orthodox historiography, so to speak, of almost all historians up until a few years ago, that the rise of state regulation, federal regulation, progressive period, essentially comes about because we have the rise of big business in the late 19th century, of large-scale industry. Big business became monopolistic, in quotes, and because of the evils of monopoly were then perceived by a rising group of workers, farmers, and the reform intellectuals. And these guys got together and then corrected these evils through the great measures of the progressive period, the new freedom, the new era, the new nationalism, the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the Great Society, etc., etc. But these are essentially programs to reform big business, the big business monopoly which arose in the free market. So in my view, the revisionist view is that the story is almost exactly the opposite. In other words, that what happened with the rise of big business and large-scale industry was a truly progressive, in a small p sense, growth of industrial progress, standard of living, productivity, etc., on the free market. Many big business interests would have liked to achieve monopoly through cartels and trusts, etc., on the free market. These things were launched in many areas, but they almost all failed miserably because of the winds of competition. And then, having seen that these things failed, various big business interests turned to the state apparatus to do the cartelizing work for them, to do the monopolizing work for them, which they could not achieve in the free market. So then the basic interpretation of the progressive period, the new nationalism, the New Deal, etc., etc., to lump them all together in obviously simplified fashion. The basic interpretation then becomes that the essences of these movements are the turning to the state apparatus to perform the monopolizing function that could not be achieved in the free market. Now, to do this requires a certain amount of flim-flammery. Forrest mentioned this morning about illusions of the opium of the people. I might differ with him on whether this opium is necessary or not. At any rate, it was certainly necessary to achieve the goals that the people wanted to achieve. So if you want to turn to the free market to arrive at a monopolization, cartelization, if you want to turn to the government to do this, one of the things you have to do is to realize, of course, that in a democracy, in a country where voting, of course, is endemic, you can't tell us to the public, can't tell the public, well, we have to have the ICC and the FTC, et cetera, insurance regulation, blah, 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 almost not to infinity, because we want to monopolize and we want to restrict production and raise prices and allocate sales, stuff like that. This would not go over very big with the American public. So the great shell game of our century was then accomplished, basically, through telling the public that we're doing this in the name of combating monopoly. And was in the name of antitrust, in the name of restricting big business, the evils of big business. This cartelization was accomplished. So we have the great paradox of monopoly, or monopolization in the name of anti-monopolization. This, of course, could be sellable to the public. There was a great traditions, Bill Beach, I think, referred to this afternoon, of anti-monopoly rhetoric and ideology on the part of the public. So it was easy to sell this kind of movement on that basis. To do that, however, you needed, of course, the alliance with the intellectuals I mentioned before, to successfully sell this great con game, a great shell game to the American public. We needed the cartelizing interests needed a cadre of intellectuals, a group of intellectuals, to form this feat, rather remarkable feat. And they had it in the form of the progressive intellectuals, in my view. The social workers, the economists, the sociologists, social scientists, settlement house workers, etc., etc. This whole cadre of professional intellectuals which arose during the late 19th century. And by the early 20th, for various reasons we're trying to develop, were ready and willing to perform this kind of feat, this kind of alliance. They also needed, in this partnership, this partnership or statism, they also needed to bring out of existence a group of labor unions. I don't deal too much with this in the lecture, but to some extent, industrial unionism, the proletariat arises in the sense that a group of industrial employees. And the colonizing interests felt that they also needed a disciplined labor force to be willing to go along with this and take a junior partnership role in this great tripartite alliance. This labor force was found in the form of the American Federation of Labor and Samuel Gompers, so the embodiment of quote responsible unquote unionism. So we begin to forge then in the progressive period, solidified during World War I, continuing on really ever since in various forms. We begin to forge what I call the triple alliance later on between various groups of big business interests, progressive intellectuals, and responsible labor unions. These form the great center of American life. They form the matrix of the consensus, and there are, of course, all sorts of differences within that consensus, differences of emphasis. But I think this really, starting a progressive period, really forms the matrix for American life from then on, up until the present. I think the important lesson for ourselves right now is that we're still living under this kind of system, this kind of triple alliance. So that what we see in the progressive period is the emergence of the current system. The seeds are crying out, finally, the culmination of the present system of this triple alliance. What the intellectuals get out of the triple alliance, I'll deal with a little bit more later on, is essentially power, prestige, and pelf. Out of the system, they get the cushy jobs in the establishment. Also, they get something else. I also point out. I want to anticipate later on lecture 6 or whatever it's going to be. They have a feeling which begins to arise in this period, which hits them later on. In addition to the power and pelf, they have the ideological feeling the laissez-faire capitalism is outmoded for one reason or another. It's only fit for agrarian system or whatever, small business. They don't like Marxian socialism because it's too unaesthetic. It's too class struggle oriented, too proletarian. So what they're looking for is a third way, a middle way, or third way, or whatever, which will harmonize all classes under the great aegis of the federal government or the central government, with the triple alliance, with them and big business and responsible unionism in power. As I say, there'd be different emphases one way or the other, and they figure they find this system in this new system of what we want to call it. There are many names for it. Corporate state is one of my favorites, and they find this very cozy alliance which will harmonize all classes, which will bring the public together. Everybody will find his place in this great sort of status system. It's not, of course, unique to the United States, which is something else I'm really anticipating again. But at any rate, it's not unique to the United States. This is also going on in Western Europe, in Germany, and Italy, and France, and Britain, in various degrees. The search for the new system of the mixed economy, or whatever you want, state monopoly capitalism, or whatever you want to call it. And the search takes different forms in different countries, and they redound back and forth and influence each other along the way. Reaches probably its first developed peacetime form in Mussolini's Italy, corporate state or economic fascism. Okay, so what I'm going to try to work on now, the first step in this analysis, is the rise of big business. Point out, just give a few examples. Obviously, it's not going to be a comprehensive history. A few examples of the rise of big business, how big business arose on the market, performing a progressive and even heroic role, progressive with a small p, and then how they try to achieve trusts and cartels and how they all flopped. So that's going to be sort of the theme of the first. Before we get to the progressive period, we set the stage for it. Incidentally, this is just sort of one little note, sort of a side anecdote. Very little revisionist work has been done about the origin of the antitrust law, the original, the Sherman Act, 1890. The only thing I have to say about that were just two small points. One is it was put in by the Republicans the Republicans have always been, of course, committed to a high tariff. And high tariff was known to the Democrats of the days and other laissez-faire types, or quasi-laissez-faire types, as the mother of trusts. You can't really have even a fairly successful trust in an industry without a high tariff to keep out foreign competition. And the Republicans, of course, being committed to a high tariff, had to show that they were really just as anti-monopolistic as the Democrats, and so they put through the Sherman Act. And number two, this is a kind of cute little story. I really have no evidence. I haven't followed up on this. I sort of throw it at anybody interested in following this lead. Apparently, Senator Sherman, of course, was a distinguished, highly conservative Ohio Republican, was trying to run for the presidency in 1888. It was, and he thought he was going to get the Republican nomination. He was apparently shafted out of it partially by the work of a certain General Russell Alger, who was the head of the Diamond Match Company, which is kind of a monopoly match company. And apparently Alger paid off some of the Sherman delegates, at least this is the charge, bribed them with pieces of silver of one sort or another, and got them to shift away to somebody else. Anyway, in the course of this thing, Sherman loses out. And when President Harrison signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, he's reported to have said to one of his aides, Senator Sherman just fixed General Alger. In other words, interpreting the Sherman Antitrust Act as essentially a bitter sort of vengeance kind of thing against General Alger and the Diamond Match Company, because it was presumably expected they would be one of the first companies on the grid if this were ever sort of used. At any rate, the Sherman Act wasn't really used very much until after 1900, so it has become important to our story at this point. Those are two sort of economic interpretations of the Sherman Act to sort of throw out. Okay, the heroic rise of big business on the market. I sort of blush a little bit here to say that just by accident I'm starting off in the electric industry. and Thomas Edison. I know, of course, infinitely less about it than Forrest McDonald, so I'm just going to be I'm not going to pretend any omniscience on the subject of Thomas Edison. The main point I wanted to stress here is that, as I mentioned the point that Forrest mentioned this morning, that Edison's major interest was in profitability. His whole thrust of his invention, his spirit of invention, was motivated by profits. He's only really interested in profit, which he directed his energy to that phase of electricity, or that phase of inventions in general, which he considered to be have the most profitable opportunities. And he was always driving. His major interest was in minimum cost. Now, apparently, and here again, Forrest will know more about this than I do, but apparently, many of the other inventors, for example, he was trying to invent a light bulb, a serviceable light bulb, which was apparently extremely difficult. And he saw that he was the first person to see you have to have a high resistance on the wire in order to cut down the cost of the copper wire, which apparently is one of the major items of cost. Apparently all the other inventors who were sort of competing with him in this, like Maxim and Swan and these people, were constantly concentrating on a lamp of low resistance, which apparently would be more durable. And presumably they were doing this for aesthetic purposes, that this somehow fit more into their Weltanschauung. Whereas Edison was interested, but on the other hand, would be too expensive to be really practical, and so Edison immediately saw you had to work on the idea of a high resistance lamp. And he did this throughout. He chose electric lighting over other possible areas, as I mentioned, because he thought this would be the highest expected profits to be reaped in electric lighting. He chose to work on incandescent lights over arc lights because he figured this would be the higher profitability. They started off by saying the price of the electric light has got to be at least as low as the price of gas light. It can't be any higher. He refused to even think in terms of a higher cost. And he's the first one to think in these terms in the electric business. So he's constantly interested. You analyze each part of cost, each element, and constantly see how to minimize that particular element. He works on a highly efficient dynamo in order to cut costs as much as possible. And same way with the transmission network. So, and he develops feeder networks again on this whole basis. His whole motivation was toward lowering costs and thereby increasing profits. In 1883, he develops the three-wire system, which saves. Well, first of all, he develops a two-network feeder system, which cuts the cost of copper by 85%, which was an enormous, almost incredible cost cut. Then in 1883, he works out a three-wire system, which cuts the cost of copper another 63%. The result of all this was to reduce the cost of copper per lamp from $25 per lamp to $1.50, just in a few years' time. Then he develops the meter, the whole concept of the meter, in order to get people, soak the guys make them pay as they're using the electricity, which is another brilliant and purely, profit-oriented kind of thinking. And again, which of course gives the consumer the incentive to economize in peak loads and all the rest of it. So he develops, on this basis, he develops central station lighting and generators and electric lights and all the rest of it. One of the things about Edison is he's again typical of creative geniuses. He insisted on running everything himself, apparently, every aspect of the business. This, of course, becomes a weakness finally, because if you don't delegate authority or interest in any aspect, you constantly try to keep your finger in every pie. Of course, he finally becomes a cropper, in a sense, in the creativity end of things, refusing to consider the idea of an alternating current. And here you have a case of another independent, creative, hard-nosed type, George Westinghouse, who comes up with the alternating current generator, even more efficient and less costly, and so forth and so on. Interestingly enough, and again, you had to have alternating current in order to have any kind of transmission beyond a very high density area. And both of these guys are extremely independent. Both cases, I think, they were told by all the big shots and experts of the day, all the scientists and engineers and mathematicians, that it can't work, couldn't possibly work, can't get this. There were even mathematical proofs, I think, that it can't work. It's like there were mathematical proofs that they couldn't get a plane off the ground. In both cases, they ignored the experts. In both cases, they made a lot of mistakes, in the sense that they would go off on kooky tangents. Westinghouse, for example, spent a large portion of the later years of his life trying to find an atmospheric engine to generate power out of the atmosphere, something like a science fiction kind of thing. Which, of course, wasn't successful. So in all these cases, they were willing to crash out and go out of the frontiers. Westinghouse, of course, refuses to go along with the attempt to have a trust in the electric industry with the formation of General Electric, inspired by J.P. Morgan, who was the great inspirer of trusts. He refused to go along, continues independent Westinghouse company, angers the establishment, has a big stock war in the stock market with the Morgans and wins, and generally plays an extremely heroic role, both Edison and Westinghouse, because are exemplary non-robber baron type big businessmen. Westinghouse built up his company, by the way, and being outside the Morgan ambit, he built up his company largely, apparently, on his own funds and funds of his friends, at least originally. Okay, we got, after this quick survey of the electric industry, we get, of course, the famous example of so-called evil robber baron type monopoly, which is Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller. In many of these cases, by the way, you have the so-called Horatio Alger model of work. In one of these cases, these big businessmen start very poor. They start as grocers or something like that, as Rockefeller did, and they work themselves up purely from scratch without any kind of establishment help. Rockefeller starts in Cleveland as a poor bookkeeper, low-income bookkeeper, and he becomes a commission grocer. He gets funds, he saves up money in the classic pattern. He borrows money from his father, from relatives, from friends and associates, and he founds Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler Company. In 1867, go into oil refining shortly after oil was discovered. He continues to work on making the business more and more efficient. He has there, being at Cleveland, he's centrally located. He's got the Lake Erie route, water route. He's near the source of oil in western Pennsylvania, so he's got this, and eastern Ohio. And so Cleveland becomes, a very good place to found the oil refinery in that period. In 1870, he sets up the Standard Oil Company of Ohio as a corporation. While this is being done, while he sets himself up and very quickly as the largest oil refinery, the price of kerosene, of course, in this period, the major use of oil was not, of course, gasoline, which only comes in later with the automobile, but kerosene, which was used as the big illuminant for lighting and so forth. And during this period, while Rockefeller is developing one of the largest oil refineries, the price of kerosene goes down, plummets, with competition, with expansion of the market, expansion of production. It plummets. The wholesale price of kerosene, for example, in 1863 was 45 cents a gallon, and in a fairly short period of time, in about a decade or so, it goes down to about 6 cents a gallon. So we have a constant lowering of the price of kerosene during the so-called building up of the so-called monopolies. See, it's a peculiar thing. In economics, at least those economists who are bitterly opposed to monopoly, the usual argument against monopoly is that the monopoly restricts production and raises prices. It's a rather odd thing to attack so-called monopoly, where the result of the whole thing is a constant increase in production, a constant lowering of price, which is what usually happens in this period. Andrew Carnegie, again with Pittsburgh, very near, of course, Cleveland, becoming a big steel city. Carnegie starts off as a poor Scottish immigrant, gets money from friends and associates, saves up some money, develops a steel business, and through plowing back of profits, and again, the old sort of classic model. And well, get back to Rockefeller. One of the charges is, of course, one of the famous charges, the classic textbook charges. The reason why Rockefeller was able to build up Standard Oil as a monopoly is because he got rebates from the railroads. He got secret rebates, or even not so secret rebates. Well, one of the problems with that is that almost everybody got rebates in those days. I mean, rebates is sort of like a general thing. Every company, and almost every shipper in almost every field got rebates. Rebates were the method by which the railroads, of course, competed amongst themselves. In other words, cutting prices from list. This is essentially a method of your list price is $2 a bushel for whatever it is for widgets, and you tell this guy, well, if you give me, if you order 200 bushels, I'll give it to you for $1.50. This is sort of the ordinary method of competing in the business world. So you had almost everybody getting rebates. So the whole rebate thing is really a big red herring, probably. I mean, this alleged rise of Rockefeller. Aside from that, Rockefeller finally develops his own pipelines, where, of course, you don't use railroads at all. So it's far from sort of building his whole empire up on rebates. By the late 1870s, he's really shifting to building pipelines rather than using railroads at all. He tries a monopoly cartel kind of arrangement with the South Improvement Company in 1871. Which was for he and various railroads and various oil companies, oil refineries get together, and they make an agreement that they were band together in this cartel arrangement, and they would allocate quotas of shipments between railroads. Each railroad gets assigned quotas of oil, and Pennsylvania Railroad was supposed to get 45%, and Erie Railroad 27.5%, and so forth. And in return, the oil refiners are supposed to get larger rebates and allocate their shipments. And what happens to the South Improvement Company cartel is what happens to virtually every cartel in the history of the world. I know it's a very sweeping statement, but I'm willing to go out on a limb and say in virtually every cartel in the history of the world, it collapses very, very quickly unless the government steps in and supports it. The reason why cartels tend to collapse, and we see this time and time again, almost a litany of collapse. Well, two basic reasons. One is internal and the other is external. If a group of companies get together and decide, well, first of all, the usual model for a cartel, the usual model is the average person thinks of people getting together and raising prices almost automatically. Let's say, there are 12 steel companies, let's say, and they all get together at a Union League Club for martinis, and they say, hey, Jim, how about raising the price 10%? Great, terrific. That's a brilliant idea. Let's do it. This is the usual sort of layman's view of, as Adam Smith once said, that businessmen are always trying to conspire to raise prices. Well, the point is, it's not that they wouldn't like to do that. They all like to have higher prices. However, there's one big catch, and one reason why it can't be done over Martini or the Union League Club. And the reason is that in order to raise prices, you have to cut production. You have to cut shipments. And no businessman likes to cut production. Every businessman likes to increase production, likes to expand, etc. So the idea of cutting production is like a bone in the throat of any self-respecting businessman. And then, aside from even if you accept the idea in principle, you have to sit down and really hammer it out. How much are you going to cut? Who's going to cut what? And this is the sort of negotiation. There you need very lengthy negotiations, and never really gets resolved satisfactorily. Usually, of course, the cut is on the basis of historic production. So if the steel industry, let's say, got together in a cartel and they say, well, let's see, 1973, U.S. Steel has 20% of the market, and Jones and Lockwood has 8% or whatever. Let's do it on that basis, and each producer will cut his production, let's say, by 10%. Well, you think that was fairly simple. However, there are a lot of problems with that. For one thing, there's always changes in business. One company might be suddenly coming up with a new process which could expand its production, hopefully its share of the market by a lot next year. So it doesn't want to cut back. They don't want to cripple themselves. Hey, we're going to have a great new process coming out. We're not going to cripple. We're not going to cut our share of the market by 10%. We could probably expand it another 20. So you have all these fantastic tensions, or what the Marxists call inner contradictions, in any attempt at having a cartel kind of arrangement. So what almost always happens with a cartel, if they finally do get together and agree on cutting production, you cut production here, you ship this to here, I'll take that market, and so on and so on. And two things happen. One is that the firms themselves, the individual firms, they look at the situation. They will have higher profits, presumably, now, because they raise their price. And they look at the thing and they agree to cut production, they say, and they agree to cut sales, but then in the dead of night, they go out and say, look, you're getting a lot of profits here. I'm going to cut production a little bit in secret. You go to Jim, your big buyer, you say, look, I have an agreement that the price of widgets is going to be $10 a box. However, for you, since you're a great guy and a fellow Rotarian and a good customer, I'm going to make it $8 a box, or $8.50 a box, but don't tell anybody. Right? So then, of course, Jim loves this, and he triples his purchases. And, of course, in a few months, as things go, the word leaks out. Secrets aren't kept very long anyway. So then the competitor finds out that this guy secretly cut production. He denounces him bitterly for chiseling and scabbing, or whatever the corporate analog for scabbing is. He says, nuts to him, I will cut also at $8.50 and so forth and so on, and everybody else follows at the end of the cartel. Now, this is the internal pressure to break a cartel. The external pressure is that other guys look around. Hey, the widget industry just had a cartel. They've increased their price by 30%, and they're having a high profit. Let's nip in there. So the outside pressure is the other guys from Canada or new entrepreneurs, or guys who have previously been independent capitalists. Let's produce some widget plants. Let's get in on this bonanza. All right, so they get in on the widget bonanza, and what are the existing widget companies going to do? They're up the creek, so to speak, because they can only do two things. Either because the new guys will undercut the cartel, and you've had it. Once again, the cartel busts. Or you can say, well, let's let these guys in on the quota. But then you have to make a new quota. You have to carve out a new quota for this new widget company, which means all the existing firms have to take another big cut in their production. And this is, again, a fantastic growth. And even if they do it, some new guy will come in, a second new guy will come in, and the whole thing goes bust. So what happens is that in the process of trying to form a cartel, inevitably, with a combination of internal pressure and external pressure, new companies coming in and old companies secretly cutting prices, the thing collapses. It only collapses unless the government steps in and prevents it from happening, keeps other companies out, or keeps prices from being cut. Of course, I'm not going to get into the railroad caper now because it really precedes the period I want to focus on. But in the case of the railroads, as Coco points out, the railroads and regulation, and as George Hilton has pointed out, these J.P. Morgan and other people try to desperately keep forming pool after pool, cartel after cartel in the 1870s and early 80s, and they all say, great, we're going to raise our freight rates, we're going to cut shipping, allocate shipments, and so on, and they do it, and in a few months or so, some other railroad comes in as a secret rebates, and the whole thing collapses. So then you have to turn to the state apparatus to enforce it. In the case of the railroads, you had one of the first things the ICC did, of course, in the name of attacking monopoly, was to outlaw secret rebates. The purpose of if you tell the public secret rebates are an evil thing, they're monopolistic, it sounds bad, secret in the first place. Anything secret sounds evil. So if you sell the policy to the public on that basis, and what you're doing when you outlaw secret rebates is you're outlawing the major method by which a cartel is broken internally. So, this is why, of course, in the Bismarck period and later in Germany, when cartels come in a big way, the German government's enforcing it to the hilt. You have to, if you're a steel company in Germany, you have to join the cartel, you have to accept the cartel's decisions are enforceable by the government, by the courts and the police, and if you violate any decisions, you're in trouble. Anyway, in the case of the South Improvement Company, they did not have the government apparatus behind them, and so the thing quickly collapsed. The other big charge about not only Rockefeller but many other companies in that period, I mentioned this in this bibliography, I don't go into it in detail in lectures, is the way Rockefeller achieved his ends, his monopoly status, the way many other corporations achieve monopoly status is through what's known as predatory price cutting. You get this, incidentally, if any of you, of course, have taught, undergraduates. Somehow the entire undergraduate population of America has absorbed this mythology. I don't know where they got it from. But anyway, the idea is, well, A&P or Standard Oil, whatever, the way they got big because they cut their costs, they deliberately took losses, they were bigger than the other guys, they took losses, they drove the other guys out of business, and then they raised prices. This is a famous model. You lower your prices, you take losses, and then you drive the other guys out and you suddenly raise prices again. I don't think there's one authentic case of this, empirically. Maybe there is, but I don't know of any. Those economists who study this in some detail have found out that the cases are all a mythology. John McGee's done, of course, a classic article on Standard Oil of New Jersey, the alleged predatory price cutting there, and Richard Zerbe for the American Sugar Refining Company, and Kenneth Elzinga for the Gunpowder Trust, demonstrating this never happened. There's good arguments in economic theory why it shouldn't happen. For one thing, it's a very risky business. In the first place, the big company is not necessarily more competitive than the small company. And I mentioned last night about the pushcart peddler. If A&P tried this with a pushcart peddler, I don't think A&P would win out. Secondly, the large company is taking heavier losses when they're doing this because they have a larger volume of business. They can be in very bad trouble, and they don't know when this thing is going to end. This is another problem. How long is this supposed war going to go on? Thirdly, supposing they drive the other guys out of it, supposing they have a lot of bankrupt oil refineries around, what happens to these bankrupt oil refineries? They don't get blown up. Somebody buys them at auction, bankrupt, picks them up for a song, and then waits for Standard Oil, let's say the alleged hypothetical Standard Oil case where you finally at last get a chance to raise your rates, your prices, after absorbing these losses for many years, and all of a sudden you see this pest from around the corner nipping in and undercutting it, because he started off with almost no capital costs. He's bought this refinery for next to nothing. So it's extremely risky kind of procedure to undertake. Also, one of the peculiar things is nobody seems to worry about, everybody's worried about the beginning of the process. If you're really interested in the welfare of a consumer, I as a consumer, you as consumers, we should be very happy about this as long as the price war is going on. What we should be saying is, hey, it's terrific. Standard Oil is giving their oil away and selling it for a penny a gallon or something. Great, terrific. We'll wait until they drive everybody out and we raise the price, then they finally get their so-called monopoly price, then we can bellyache. We don't have some bellyaching now. Interestingly enough, the final monopoly price never seems to arrive in this situation. One of the things which amuses me is the clipping I came across in the New York Times about the 1950s. The German steel industry, I think, or German business in general, was petitioning the West German government to resume the idea of compulsory cartels, which they had dropped after World War II. And here was the argument they used. The interesting thing is to get to the argument. It said, I wish I had this thing with me. They said, in effect, if you don't impose cartels now, what you're going to have is big businesses are going to drive out the small business out of existence, and then they're going to raise prices. So therefore, that was the argument. The argument then is we should impose an inefficient compulsory cartel now to keep these inefficient, crummy firms in business and raise prices and restrict production now, because otherwise, if you don't do that, you'll have an efficient monopoly sometime in the future, which might raise prices. And the interesting thing is they felt they could even get away with this line of argument. So as I say, there have been many studies of this. What apparently happened with the way in which Rockefeller and the Sugar Trust and gunpowder trusts, etc. The way they try to establish their monopoly is not by taking losses and trying to drive firms out of business and absorbing all these headaches, but simply by buying them up, by merger kind of agreement. You make an agreement, you buy them up, you try to have efficiencies in large scale, supposed efficiencies in very large scale production, which is essentially what Rockefeller did. One of the things that happened, I'm really anticipating a little bit now, but one of the things that happened then was that when this sort of thing occurs, when Rockefeller tries to buy up all refineries, or the sugar glucose company, whatever it is, tries to buy up all the glucose plants, what you have then is something like farm price supports. If the government says, we stand ready to buy all soybeans at X dollars a bushel, which is way above the market price, that means you start developing a new industry in the world. The industry is building plants to sell to Rockefeller, building refineries that Rockefeller has to buy it, or building sugar plants that the sugar guys will have to buy it. So in other words, if the government isn't coercively keeping the new firms out, what you have is new guys, great heroic entrepreneurs, saying, okay, let's stick Rockefeller with another refinery, let him choke on this. So you build a refinery, you force them to buy it. And finally, Rockefeller said, I'm not going to play blackmail these SOBs, I'm getting out of this thing, I'm not going to try to achieve a monopoly, the hell with it. which is sort of the natural result of this whole process, unless, as I say, the government steps in, prevents them from building new plants to begin with. Well, Standard Oil, had natural advantages, entrepreneurial advantages. They had this location in Cleveland. They had first ones to really move into large-scale marketing. For one thing, the first ones to build bulk stations. Whole idea of bulk stations. They were more efficient as managers and entrepreneurs than the rest of the competition. They wind up by the 1880s with 90% of the U.S. oil refining. You can't get much higher percentage than that. And by 1899, we have the new Standard Oil of New Jersey. There's a holding company for the various state Standard Oil companies. So by the 1880s and 1890s, they have approximately 87% of the refining, 86% of the marketing. They never had much more than a third of the crude oil, by the way. Of course, crude oil has always been extremely competitive in the sense of many producers. So what happens to them? And what happens to them is, well, let me tell more about the efficiency of Standard Oil first. One of the things which Standard Oil pioneered, and Rockefeller pioneered in the days when there was still Standard Oil of Ohio, was they were the first guys to reduce freight costs by having large car loads, by having train load lots, by having a regular steady flow of traffic with a fixed amount per day, train loads, etc. They're the first guys to really carry their own fire insurance, and provide their own terminal facilities for the oil and so forth. And they were the first guys to come up with Standard Oil, come up with important technological innovations in the oil refining business, the Burton cracking process, the Thrash process applied to oil, and so forth and so on, the byproducts, improving lubricants, distributing, as I mentioned before, and so forth. One of the things, I guess, which should be, it's kind of a cute thing, I guess I should mention a little bit, which Alan Nevins exposed. Alan Nevins exposed some of the great myths in this book on the study of power. The myth of the Buffalo explosion. This is the thing where Rockefeller was supposed to have sent agents in to blow up a competing oil company called the Buffalo Lube Company. I guess it was Buffalo Lubricating Company. And the theory was that the Standard Oil people had induced an employee to pack a safety valve with plaster, and thereby cause it to blow up. First place, nothing was blown up. By the way, a lot of interesting things about this sort of story. First place, nothing was blown up because the plaster broke. So there was no explosion. Number one. And one of the stories here is that the owner of this independent Buffalo Lube Company is supposed to be a heroic chap named Charles Matthews. The actual situation, well, there's several things which Nevins lists, sort of like a litany here, sort of attacking every facet of this myth. One was that safety valves was usually packed because it was as a safety measure to prevent gas leakage. So there's no great thing, no unusual thing about packing the valve. 2, it was supposed to break when the valve blew open. It wasn't, it sort of broke by accident. Safety valves very often broke. 3, the Matthews and associates were former disgruntled employees of the Vacuum Oil Company, which is a subsidiary of Standard, who were engaging in all sorts of illegal activities in their plant. And finally, they built their plant purely for the purpose of selling it to Standard Oil for this this merger kind of process. Really, as a quote blackmail unquote operation. So every one, and of course, finally, the guy who was supposed to have done this, Mr. Archibald, of course, one of Rockefeller's big associates, knew nothing of any of this stuff at all. I mean, so every facet of this myth turns out to be incorrect. There's a similar thing. This has nothing to do with the subject. It has to do with historians. There's a similar myth about J.P. Morgan getting his first, earning his first dollar by selling defective arms in the Civil War. This has been beautifully exploded by what's his name? Paul Gordon Wasson, book. Showing every facet of this myth. Not only was every facet of this thing wrong, not only what the arms weren't defective and so forth and so on, and J.P. Morgan had nothing to do with it, but also that every historian, as each historian repeated the story, he kept embellishing it. Not only copying from the previous story, but embellishing with more stuff against Morgan, and no basis whatsoever. That's right. Rockefeller, incidentally, another important thing for political front, is that Rockefeller, from the very beginning, or from almost the very beginning, and continuing on to the present day, really, which is, I think, the importance of this, has always been associated not only with his own family, many members of his family, but also with a whole bunch of other families. There's a sort of family association, both in investment and I think also in politics. So we have a combination of the Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller family, his brother William Rockefeller and his descendants, the Harkness family, the Flagler family, the Payne and Whitney comes in as a descendant of the Payne, the Bostwicks, the Pratts, the Brewsters, the Rogerses, the Archbolds. And these names sort of keep popping up from then on. Just one that I can't resist at this point, and we're completely out of alignment here. I can't resist this, so I might not get to it later on, about Rockefeller and Pratt. During the Eisenhower administration, the Secretary of State, of course, was John Foster Dulles. I think Forrest mentioned this morning he was a partner of Sullivan and Cromwell, who was a Standard Oil, essentially, law firm. But not only that, Dulles, this is something which is not only known to certain genealogists, students of genealogy in the modern world. Dulles was married to Janet Pomeroy Avery, who happened to be the first cousin of John D. Rockefeller Jr., which makes Dulles a kinsman, a member of the Rockefeller family, in an important sense. And then we had Allen W. Dulles, his brother, was the head of the CIA, also some importance in foreign policy making. And then we had his sister Eleanor Lansing Dulles, big shot on the Asia desk of the State Department. And then we had this Undersecretary of State, was a beloved figure from Boston named Christian Herter. And Christian Herter was a dynamic, charismatic fellow with a limp, if I remember, which made him even more charismatic. But Christian Herter, this again was not really highlighted in the press at the time, was married to a Pratt. His wife, in other words, was a member of the Pratt family, which fits into the Rockefeller-Pratt conspiracy view of the Eisenhower administration. Anyway, I wanted to emphasize the fact that the Rockefeller and their associates continue on, sort of very loyal associates from then on, both in economics and politics. But what happens to the Standard Oil monopoly? They're 90%, or essentially 90%. What happens to it is it begins to crack, and it cracks before the dissolution, before the Antitrust action. The 90% by 1911. For example, 90% begins to collapse to about 60 to 65%, which is a considerable slippage. Or to have some more figures here. In 1899, Standard Oil had 90% of the refining in the United States, oil refining. In 1904 to 07, it was down to 84%. By 1911, it was down to 80. By 1921, it was down to 50. The number of refiners increases from oil refiners increases from 67 in 1899 to 147 in 1921. What happens is new competitors come up. In the first place, Standard Oil This happens to many big businesses. Many big businesses become overly big and overly bureaucratic. We were talking this morning about bureaucracy and the problem. But what happens is, I mentioned a little bit about Xerox and Polaroid. What happens is that if the situation is fluid enough and the market free enough, new firms pop up which take advantage of the mistakes of the old firms, the bureaucratic regressiveness of the old firms. What happens is that the Standard Oil begins to fall behind in the oil revolution, because there were several oil revolutions. One was the fact that the major production of oil begins to shift, of course, from kerosene to gasoline, for two reasons. Obviously, electricity begins to come up to replace kerosene and lamps. And secondly, because the automobile begins to come up and gasoline becomes increasingly important there. Standard Oil falls behind in the shift. Having emphasized kerosene all of its existence, it begins to, be slower than its competitors in realizing what's going on and swinging with a new system. Secondly, as new Standard Oil, of course, had always been concentrated in the western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio oil fields. And we begin to find that after 1900, 1920 approximately, we begin to find new oil fields, the Texas and Gulf California, the mid-continent oil field. All these oil fields begin to be discovered, and Standard Oil is late in realizing it, and late in taking advantage of it, and late in getting crude oil in there, getting refineries to absorb it. And for example, in 1899, 63% of the oil refined was kerosene. In 1919, only 15% was kerosene. It's a big shift to gasoline. And the independents, new independents coming up, like Tidewater Oil Company and Gulf Oil Company, which of course is essentially Mellon, the Mellon family, and this Tidewater Associated Oil Company, are much more alive to this whole new shift in economic and technological data. Also, even though Standard Oil had led the field in the old days, in the 1880s or 90s, in bulk stations and things like that, the independents lead Standard Oil in things like gasoline stations. The idea of the filling station for gasoline, this is of course a brand new thing. You have to think of it first. It's one of these things that somebody mentioned today, I think, that you have to, it's easy once somebody shows you the way. It's easy to think of a gasoline station after somebody else has thought of it and put it into effect. But the independents lead Standard Oil in developing the idea of a gasoline filling station. They also lead the idea of petrochemicals later on. The whole petrochemical industry essentially Standard Oil was way behind in that. And the idea of tank cars and that whole business, again, is essentially led by the independents. Incidentally, another big monopoly, I was getting to a hopeful monopoly, U.S. Steel, which I'll get to in a second, another Morgan company, established in 1901 as a supposed monopoly in the steel business, fantastically retrogressive, the last firm to develop the basic oxygen process. They installed the basic oxygen process, which is the biggest thing since the early 1900s. And the steel business, for one reason, is because, of course, they had lousy and bureaucratic management, and another reason they had all this investment in previous processes which they felt they were stuck with. The first firms that begin to develop the basic oxygen process in the 30s is small German companies. And then the small American companies begin to adopt them. U.S. Steel is the last to swing with a new dispensation, and therefore, of course, its share of the market has been slipping for a long, long time. Okay, the iron and steel business. We have, again, a sort of Horatio Alger thing with Carnegie and Frick, who's working on Superior Coke, and Carnegie is working on Superior Steel, and they get together and they have an integrated kind of company. The first ones to think of leasing iron ore from Minnesota and having an ore carrier fleet and having a generally integrated corporation. And they developed the Carnegie Steel Company, which had something like 25 to 30% of total steel production in the 1890s. Now we come to Morgan and his associate or agent or whatever you want to call him, Judge Albert H. Gary, and they developed the U.S. Steel Company as a merger of a whole bunch of steel companies, including Federal Steel, in 1901, which developed out of a series of mammoth mergers. Again, the idea, as Arthur Dewing, is a very neglected economic historian of this period, pointed out, what happened is these guys got carried away. They realized there was a great efficiencies of large-scale production and large-scale distribution. They saw that happening in the rise of big business. Therefore, they felt that, big is good and bigger must be better, and biggest must be still better. And they didn't realize there were diseconomies of large-scale production. When you get larger and larger and larger, something's going to crack. You're you're going to become too bureaucratic, you have too much management deadwood and not enough internal market or whatever. And so you can understand why they want to develop a merger, a monopoly setup, and you'll see how the whole thing began to crack. Not only iron and steel and oil, but almost every other industry to boot. During the 1880s and 1890s, there were approximately over 700 iron and steel companies in the United States. There were numerous attempts at pools and cartels, and they all flopped. And finally, there was a series of mammoth mergers. They figured if we can't cartelize, maybe we can just merge, which seems to be simpler and more permanent. Incidentally, an interesting point, I think made by Weinstein, or Sklar, or some other great conspiratorial historian, was that one of the effects of the Sherman Antitrust Act, if you outlaw cartels, or voluntary cartels, one of the things you do is you stimulate mergers. Because a merger is not a cartel, it's not a conspiracy, it's simply merge. So you have an overstimulation of mergers by the so-called anti-monopoly law really leads to a lot of mergers and trust. And this might have been, I don't know, because very few people have really studied the antitrust law, Sherman Act, and so forth, and the origins of it, but I have a sort of a deep, dark hunch this might have been the intended effect of the Sherman Act, Antitrust Act, to encourage mergers as against cartels. At any rate, you had a series of mammoth mergers. They wind up as U.S. Steel. And yet, U.S. Steel is a merger of approximately 138 companies, starting off with controlling 60% of the iron and steel market. Okay. The key figures are two great Morgan persons of that period, Judge Gary. I mentioned George W. Perkins will pop up more and more in my series in these lectures. Another partner of J.P. Morgan and Company. So what happens to U.S. Steel? What's the result of all this great merger? Well, first place, U.S. Steel, the price of U.S. Steel shares in 1901 was $55 a share. By 1904, it's down to $9. Profits dropped precipitously. In 1902, profits were 16% on investment. By 1904, it was down to less than 8%. Not too hot. The experiment didn't work too well. And one of the things that happened, this is an interesting thing here about this whole merger cartel problem. See, if you have a big merger, you can either you can get your monopoly price by cutting production, dropping a lot of plants and raising prices, but then you have to worry about new competitors coming in, or you can keep the price low, which is what U.S. Steel did. They kept the price low so as not to attract new competitors, then you don't have any more profits. What's the point of the whole damn thing if you can't raise prices? So you're caught again in this inner contradiction of the cartel-merger. So they had to keep their price low, so they figured they had to have some way of cartelizing. And we come to the famous Gary dinners, 1907, 1908. Judge Gary stimulating a group of dinners, banquets for in the steel industry, trying to get an agreement to raise prices and cut production. So what happens in the 1907? Here's Judge Gary with enormous prestige, with the U.S. Steel Company with 60% of the market, with a J.P. Morgan and this great power behind them. And what happens to the Gary dinners? They're a total bomb out. And by 1908, which means only a year or so after the Gary dinners, there's secret price cutting. God bless it. Secret price cutting, especially by the smaller competitors, right there under the table. And this leads finally to open price cutting. When the guys find out about it, the whole thing cracks. The whole Gary dinners collapse. The end of eating for Gary for some time. It's only with World War I, as Melvin Orlovsky points out, great work, Big Steel and the Wilson administration. It's only with the glorious culmination of the progressive ideal, which is World War I, that the Judge Gary finally finds his mission in life. So what happens with U.S. Steel? U.S. Steel has a continuing. It's really like justice triumphing, social Darwinism at work. U.S. Steel has a steady decline in its share of the market from then on. In 1901, it had 63% of ingots and castings, for example. By 1911 to 15, it was down to 52%. 1920s, it was 46%. By the 1950s, it was about 32%. I'm sure it's less than that now. It's constantly, it's a really crummy company, and it's felt the effects of it. Again, they were technically extremely conservative and bureaucratic. Not only were they the last guys to adopt the basic oxygen system, which was fairly recently, they were also almost the last guys to shift from the Bessemer process to the open hearth process, which the big shift occurred during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. U.S. Steel had enormous investment in Bessemer equipment, Bessemer plants, and it was very difficult for them to shift. And that was it. Too damn bad. So other independents pop up, with who are not Bessemer, who are not heavily committed to Bessemerism, and adopt the open hearth method. Also, U.S. Steel was very slow to enter the growing field of lighter steel product. They were committed, and I think this goes along with Bessemer method. They were committed to heavy steel, so they weren't swinging with, they weren't adapted to the idea of lighter steel products, of sheet steel, strip steel. And they were one of the last to adopt the having scrap, recycling of scrap. One of the last to adopt stainless steel and alloys. One of the last to adopt a continuous rolling mill. One of the last to... They refused to buy a structural steel patent, for example. I figured it would never work. And so, time and again, area after area, U.S. Steel flubs the dub. I think it's directly related to the genesis of U.S. Steel and its basic nature. They were locked into heavy steel, obsolete equipment, obsolete process, and a monopoly kind of mentality. There's an excellent article, a journal article, which I forgot to mention bibliography by Walter Adams on U.S. Steel in the Quarterly Journal of Economics about 10 years ago or so, on U.S. Steel's failure to adopt the basic oxygen process. So, that's the steel caper. As Gabriel Coco says on Triumph of Conservatism, quote, I know you're supposed to have read it, but I think this is a very good quote from it. Summing this up, quote, the steel industry was competitive before the World War, and the efforts of the House of Morgan to establish control and stability over the steel industry by voluntary private economic means had failed. Having failed in the realm of economics, the efforts of the U.S. Steel Group were to be shifted to politics. I think this is beautiful. It sort of sums up, I think, not only for U.S. Steel, but for the whole ball of wax. Having failed in the realm of economics, their efforts shift to politics. Incidentally, it's kind of a cute thing about Coco. This is an aside. I've been very influenced by the Coco view of the progressive era and many other libertarian, conservative, virtue philosophers, and we've been pushing a lot of Coco stuff in our literature. There's no Coco, of course, is up the wall. I mean, Coco's not exactly a very swinging type to begin with. It's not exactly, yeah, it's sort of an uptight type. He keeps being bombarded with quotations from the great Gabriel Coco from libertarian and virtue literature, and he's completely hopped up about it. He's writing letters saying, I don't believe in the free market, I hate the free market. Too bad, fella.